November 1944, the Hürtgen Forest. A frozen carpet of brown needles and mud stretches beneath a canopy so thick that daylight barely reaches the ground. Somewhere in that darkness, a man lies perfectly still. His body is pressed into a shallow depression, covered with decaying leaves, branches, and dirt. He has been there for 4 hours. His fingers are numb. His legs have lost feeling. Every breath he takes is measured, controlled, barely visible. The standard issue sniper position would have him perched on a ridgeline, silhouetted against the gray sky, waiting for targets in perfect textbook fashion. But Eddie Brennan is not following the textbook. He is breaking every rule written in the Army Sniper Manual. And by 11:47 in the morning, 18 German soldiers will be dead. The story of Eddie Brennan is not just about marksmanship. It is about survival. It is about understanding terrain the way a predator understands its hunting ground. It is about watching friends die because they followed orders that did not fit the reality of the battlefield. And it is about one man's decision to trust his instincts over doctrine, even when that decision meant facing a court-martial. Before we continue, if you appreciate these deep dives into military history, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps bring more of these forgotten stories to light. To understand what Eddie Brennan did, you first need to understand the Hürtgen Forest itself. This was not an ordinary forest. American generals called it a picture forest because German foresters had meticulously arranged the fir trees in perfect rows like soldiers on parade. But by the autumn of 1944, that picture had been shattered. The trees were gashed yellow with machine gun bullets, reduced to charred stumps by relentless artillery fire. A correspondent who walked through the Hürtgen reported that there were no birds, no sighing winds, no carpeted paths, just destruction. The forest covered an area of roughly 140 square kilometers, approximately 54 square miles, along the Belgian-German border. The terrain was rugged, broken by deep ravines and narrow fire breaks, barely wide enough for 2 jeeps to pass. The weather in late 1944 was brutal, cold, wet, cloudy. The kind of weather that grounded Allied aircraft and turned the forest floor into a muddy morass that swallowed vehicles and men alike. The Germans had been preparing for this fight since 1938. They built log bunkers with interlocking fields of fire. They strung barbed wire through the underbrush. They planted thousands of mines along every trail and fire break. One sector of the forest had a mine every 8 paces for 3 miles. Some mines were no larger than an ointment box, nearly impossible to detect in the mud and snow. American commanders underestimated all of this. They believed the German soldiers' fighting spirit had collapsed after the Normandy breakout and the disaster at the Falaise Pocket. They thought the Wehrmacht was finished. They were wrong. The Germans defending the Hürtgen were battered, yes, but they were not beaten. Many of them were veterans who had been fighting for years and understood exactly how to use this terrain to their advantage. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges commanded the First Army, the largest American fighting force in Europe, from a requisitioned hotel in the Belgian resort town of Spa. Hodges was an old-school soldier, a crack shot, who had hunted elephants in Indochina and caribou in Canada. But he rarely visited the front. He believed it was safer, sounder, and quicker to keep smashing ahead. That philosophy would cost thousands of American lives in the Hürtgen. The 9th Infantry Division was the first to enter the forest in late September. Their orders were to push through and seize the town of Schmidt, which commanded the approaches to the Roer River dams. In theory, it should have been a straightforward operation. In reality, it was a slaughter. One regiment took 4 days to advance 1 mile. Another needed 5. By mid-October, the division had suffered 4,500 casualties to gain 3,000 yards. That works out to 1 man down every 2 feet. The problem was not German strength. The problem was American doctrine. The Army Sniper Manual demanded elevated positions with clear sight lines. find high ground, establish fields of fire, control the terrain from above. In open country, this made perfect sense. In the Hürtgen, it was suicide. The trees were so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards. The fire breaks and trails that offered clear shooting lanes were pre-registered by German mortars and machine guns. Any American who set up on a ridgeline or in an elevated position was silhouetting himself against the gray sky, making himself an easy target for German counter-snipers and artillery observers. Eddie Brennan watched 3 of his friends die following exactly this doctrine in the first 2 weeks of November 1944. The first was Private Frank Jennings, November 15th. Jennings found what looked like a perfect position on a wooded slope overlooking a German supply trail. Good elevation, clear line of sight for about 200 yards. He set up just after dawn, waited patiently, and engaged 3 German soldiers before a mortar round exploded in the trees directly above him. The shell had a fuse designed to detonate on contact with branches, turning the tree canopy into a ceiling of shrapnel. Jennings was torn apart before he could move. The second was Corporal Samuel Briggs, November 19th. Briggs positioned himself on a ridgeline overlooking a crossroads. He had perfect visibility for 400 yards, textbook placement, according to the manual. A German counter-sniper spotted his silhouette within 90 minutes and called in mortar fire. Briggs took shrapnel to the throat. He drowned in his own blood before the medic reached him. The third was Sergeant Thomas Orr. November 27th. Orr used a blown-out farmhouse as a sniper nest. Second floor, western window, exactly the kind of elevated position the training emphasized. He eliminated 3 German soldiers before a Panzerfaust team identified his location and obliterated the building. 3 friends, 3 textbook positions, 3 deaths. Eddie Brennan lay awake that night in his foxhole, staring at the black silhouette of tree branches against the sky. He thought about deer. Before the war, Eddie had worked on the docks in Philadelphia, but on weekends he hunted white-tailed deer in the forests of Pennsylvania. He knew how deer survived in those woods. They did not perch on ridge lines. They did not seek elevated positions with commanding views. Deer bedded down in low brush, under fallen trees, in natural depressions where the ground itself provided concealment. They understood something that Army doctrine did not. Predators do not look down. They look across. They look up. But they almost never look at their own feet. That night, Eddie made a decision. He would stop following the manual. He would start thinking like a deer. The technique Eddie developed was simple in concept, but extraordinarily demanding in execution. Instead of seeking elevated positions, he would create hides at ground level in the leaf litter and mud of the forest floor. He would dig shallow depressions just deep enough to conceal his body when he lay flat. He would cover himself with dead leaves, broken branches, and dirt until he became indistinguishable from the terrain around him. From this position, he could see the feet and legs of any German soldier who walked past. He could track movement through the undergrowth. And most importantly, he was invisible to anyone looking for snipers in the traditional elevated positions. The risks were significant. Ground-level positions meant limited visibility. They meant lying in frozen mud for hours, risking hypothermia and frostbite. They meant being vulnerable if the enemy stumbled directly onto your position. And they meant that any attempt to reposition would require crawling through the debris without making a sound. Eddie first tested the technique on December 1st, 1944, positioning himself near a known German patrol route. He lay motionless for 6 hours in near-freezing temperatures, his body pressed into a slight fold in the terrain, covered with decomposing needles and half-frozen mud. He could hear German soldiers passing within 20 meters of his position. None of them looked down. None of them suspected that death was lying in the forest floor beneath their feet. He did not fire that day. He was gathering intelligence, learning how German patrols moved, identifying their patterns and blind spots. But the experience confirmed what he suspected. The forest floor was the last place anyone expected a threat to emerge. On December 3rd, Eddie proposed his technique to his platoon leader, Lieutenant Robert Hayes. Hayes listened, considered, and then shook his head. The technique violated standard operating procedures. It went against everything the Army taught about sniper deployment. More practically, it exposed the soldier to unacceptable risk from weather and close-quarters discovery. Hayes ordered Eddie to continue using approved tactics. Eddie complied. For 3 days, he continued working from elevated positions, achieving nothing. The German defenders had learned to scan ridgelines and tree branches for American snipers. Every viable shooting position seemed to draw fire within hours. Meanwhile, American casualties in the Hürtgen continued to mount. On December 7th, the situation reached a crisis. A German machine gun team had established itself on the edge of a firebreak, covering a crucial intersection that American patrols needed to cross. Previous attempts to neutralize the position had failed. 2 snipers who tried to engage from elevated positions had been spotted and driven off by return fire. An artillery strike had been called in, but failed to achieve a direct hit on the heavily fortified bunker. Lieutenant Hayes approached Eddie with the problem. Something had to be done. The intersection was strategically important, and every hour that German machine gun remained operational cost American lives. Eddie saw his opportunity. He explained his forest floor technique again, emphasizing that a ground-level approach might be the only way to get close enough for an effective shot without being detected. Hayes was skeptical but desperate. He gave Eddie permission to try with one condition. If the technique did not produce results within 24 hours, Eddie would abandon it and return to approved methods. Eddie spent the evening preparing his hide. He selected a location approximately 150 meters from the German position, in a slight depression partially covered by a fallen log. He gathered materials, dead leaves, broken branches, clumps of moss, even a handful of frozen mud. He practiced lying in the position, adjusting his profile until he was satisfied that nothing about his shape would suggest a human form. Before dawn on December 8th, Eddie moved to his hide. He crawled the final 50 meters on his belly, pushing himself through the forest debris, inch by inch, careful not to disturb the surface pattern of the leaf litter. By the time first light filtered through the canopy, he was in position, invisible, waiting. The cold was immediate and relentless. The ground drew heat from his body faster than his clothing could retain it. His fingers stiffened inside his gloves. His legs began to ache, then burn, then go numb. But Eddie did not move. He barely breathed. He became part of the forest floor. At 7:23 in the morning, the German machine gun opened up. Eddie heard it first, the distinctive ripping sound of an MG-42 firing somewhere east of his position. Through his scope, he could see movement around the bunker. German soldiers were adjusting ammunition belts, preparing for sustained fire. Eddie waited. A German officer emerged from the bunker, binoculars raised, scanning the tree line for any sign of American response. He stood in full view for nearly 30 seconds, confident that no sniper could engage him from the expected elevated positions. He was looking at the ridge lines. He was looking at the tree branches. He never looked at the ground. Eddie squeezed the trigger. The officer dropped instantly, binoculars still clutched in his hands. The shot came from nowhere the Germans expected. They did not know where to return fire. They did not know where to take cover. Eddie chambered another round, found the second German in his scope. The man was crouched behind a tree, weapon ready, still searching for the shooter. Eddie fired again, hit. The German pitched backward, clutching his chest. A third soldier broke and ran. Eddie tracked him, fired, missed. The third round caught one of the remaining Germans in the leg. The surviving soldier grabbed the machine gun and tried to drag it toward cover. Eddie fired again, hit him in the back. The German dropped the weapon and fell forward into the snow. 4 kills in under 2 minutes. The machine gun position was neutralized, and the Germans still did not know where the shots had come from. Eddie remained in his hide for another 3 hours, watching German reinforcements arrive to investigate the ambush. They searched the tree lines, they checked the ridges, they scanned every window and doorway in a destroyed farmhouse 400 meters away. None of them thought to search the forest floor. When Eddie finally crawled back to American lines that evening, he had 6 confirmed kills and invaluable intelligence about German defensive patterns in his sector. Lieutenant Hayes listened to his report, examined the evidence, and made a decision that would have consequences neither man anticipated. Hayes formally requested permission to deploy Eddie using his unconventional forest floor technique on a regular basis. The request worked its way up the chain of command to battalion, then to regiment. At each level, officers debated the merits of a tactic that violated established doctrine, and at each level, the immediate results spoke louder than the manual. On December 12th, Eddie was given official authorization to continue his operations. The next 8 days were the most productive of Eddie's career as a sniper. He established hides across his sector of the Hürtgen, each one carefully prepared to blend with the surrounding terrain. He learned to recognize subtle patterns in German movement, identifying the times and routes that patrols preferred. He learned to wait, sometimes for entire days, until the perfect shot presented itself. On December 14th, he engaged a German patrol that passed within 15 meters of his position. The lead soldier actually stepped over Eddie's hide without noticing the rifle barrel concealed beneath a layer of frozen leaves. Eddie let the patrol pass, then opened fire from behind, neutralizing 4 soldiers before the survivors could react. On December 15th, he positioned himself near a German supply route and eliminated 3 soldiers carrying ammunition to a forward position. The supply route was abandoned for 2 days while German commanders tried to determine where the threat was coming from. On December 16th, the day the German Ardennes offensive began, Eddie achieved his highest single-day count. 18 German soldiers eliminated in a 4-hour window from a position so low to the ground that German return fire consistently passed overhead. They were still aiming too high. They could not accept that a sniper would operate from the forest floor. By this point, word of Eddie's technique had spread through the regiment. Other riflemen began experimenting with ground-level positions. 2 of them achieved kills using variations of Eddie's method. A third got nothing but hypothermia, but the principle was proven. In the unique terrain of the Hürtgen Forest, ground-level concealment worked where elevated positions failed. And then, on December 18th, everything changed. Private Raymond Fletcher, inspired by Eddie's success, attempted to use a hollow log as an ambush position. The technique worked brilliantly. Fletcher eliminated 4 German soldiers before the survivors retreated. But during his extraction, Fletcher was captured by a German patrol that stumbled onto his position. Under interrogation, Fletcher revealed the basics of the forest floor technique. He explained how American snipers were now operating from ground level, using natural debris for concealment. He described the positions, the timing, the tactics that Eddie had developed. Within days, German commanders issued new orders. Patrol leaders were instructed to scan the ground ahead of their movements. Soldiers were warned to be suspicious of any unusual pattern in the forest floor. Counter-sniper teams began sweeping potential hide locations before advancing. The technique that had given Eddie such decisive advantage was now compromised. On December 20th, Eddie was conducting a mission near Brandenburg when a German patrol approached his hide. Unlike previous patrols, this one was moving slowly, deliberately, with soldiers actively probing the ground ahead of them. Someone had been warned. Eddie faced a choice. He could remain in his hide and hope the Germans passed without discovering him. He could open fire and attempt to neutralize the patrol before they reached his position, or he could abandon the hide and attempt to withdraw. He chose to fight. His first shot dropped the lead soldier. His second caught the nearest German in the shoulder. But the remaining soldiers, now alerted to ground-level threats, immediately dove flat and began sweeping the forest floor with automatic fire. Rounds tore through the debris around Eddie's position, snapping branches and throwing up clumps of frozen mud. Eddie pressed himself as flat as possible, trying to present no profile above the natural terrain. A round passed so close to his head that he felt the displaced air against his cheek. Another struck the stock of his rifle, splintering the wood. He fired again, missed, chambered another round, fired, hit. A German screamed somewhere to his left. Then silence. For nearly an hour, Eddie lay motionless, while German reinforcements arrived and searched the area. They came within 5 meters of his position 3 times. Each time, he controlled his breathing, suppressed every instinct to move, and let the forest floor do its work. The debris that covered him was disturbed but not obviously artificial. To searching eyes, it looked like any other patch of churned-up mud and leaves. Finally, as darkness fell, the Germans withdrew. Eddie waited another 2 hours before beginning his extraction, crawling more than 300 meters through the undergrowth, before he felt safe enough to stand. He had survived, but the close call exposed a fundamental problem. The forest floor technique worked because the enemy did not expect it. Once the Germans knew to look for ground-level threats, the advantage diminished significantly. Eddie was now operating in an environment where his tactics were known and his opponents were adapting. Over the next several days, Eddie continued his missions, but with increasing caution. He varied his approach, never using the same hide location twice, never establishing predictable patterns. He began incorporating elements of traditional sniper doctrine back into his operations, using the ground-level technique only when conditions particularly favored it. His kill count during this period dropped, but he remained effective. More importantly, he survived, and the intelligence he gathered about German positions and movements contributed to several successful American operations in the closing weeks of the Hürtgen campaign. Then came the court-martial. On January 19, 1945, Eddie Brennan was formally charged with violation of standing orders and willful deviation from approved tactical doctrine. The charges stemmed not from his forest floor technique, which by this point had been unofficially adopted by several units, but from a specific incident on January 3rd. During a mission near the village of Schmidt, Eddie had engaged a German officer from a distance of approximately 300 meters. The shot was successful, but Eddie's position was in a sector that had been designated off-limits due to concerns about friendly fire from advancing American units. Eddie had not received the updated sector boundaries before departing on his mission. The information had been transmitted to his platoon headquarters while he was already in the field. By the time he returned, the incident had already been reported up the chain of command. In another unit, with different commanders, the matter might have been resolved administratively, a written reprimand, a reminder about communication protocols. But the Hürtgen campaign had been a disaster for the American Army, and senior officers were looking for explanations. The First Army under General Hodges had suffered catastrophic losses in the forest. Entire regiments had been mauled. Division after division had been fed into the meat grinder. And now, with the Ardennes offensive adding fresh chaos, there was pressure to demonstrate that discipline was being maintained. Eddie became a convenient target. The court-martial proceedings lasted 4 days. Witnesses testified about Eddie's unconventional tactics, his willingness to deviate from established doctrine, his reputation for independent action. The prosecution painted him as a rogue operator who prioritized personal judgment over proper military discipline. The defense countered with his kill count, his intelligence contributions, and testimonials from fellow soldiers whose lives had been saved by his effectiveness. Lieutenant Hayes testified that Eddie's forest floor technique had directly contributed to the neutralization of several key German positions. In the end, the court-martial reached a mixed verdict. Eddie was acquitted of the most serious charges related to willful disobedience, but found guilty of a lesser charge related to failure to maintain proper communication. He was sentenced to reduction in rank and forfeiture of 1 month's pay. Eddie returned to duty and continued serving until the end of the war. His forest floor technique was never officially adopted into Army sniper doctrine, but elements of it influenced the development of concealment tactics in subsequent conflicts. The principle he demonstrated, that effective camouflage meant becoming part of the terrain rather than hiding behind it, would eventually become a cornerstone of modern sniper training. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest officially ended on February 17, 1945, when elements of the 82nd Airborne Division finally reached the Roer River. By that point, the American First Army had suffered at least 33,000 killed and wounded, with some estimates reaching as high as 55,000, when non-combat casualties were included. German losses were approximately 28,000. Historians have described the Hürtgen campaign as one of the most ill-conceived and unnecessary offensives of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. General Hodges was criticized for lacking tactical imagination and for pursuing frontal assaults that negated American advantages in mobility and air power. The alternative, breaking through to the southeast into open valley terrain, where American strengths could be brought to bear, was apparently never seriously considered by higher headquarters. The Hürtgen consumed units that were desperately needed elsewhere. The 28th Infantry Division, which had been rebuilt after earlier battles, was effectively destroyed again in the forest, suffering over 6,000 casualties in a single week. The 4th Infantry Division lost so many men that companies were reduced to fractions of their authorized strength. A visiting observer noted that asking soldiers how they survived in the Hürtgen was like asking men how they endured torture. Against this backdrop, Eddie Brennan's contribution seems modest: 18 confirmed kills in a single day, perhaps 60 or 70 across his entire time in the forest, numbers that barely register against the tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. But numbers do not tell the full story. Eddie's forest floor technique represented something more important than individual kills. It represented adaptation. It represented the willingness of a frontline soldier to observe, analyze, and develop solutions that his commanders had not considered. It represented the fundamental truth that doctrine must serve the reality of the battlefield, not the other way around. The German defenders of the Hürtgen understood this. They used the terrain brilliantly, leveraging their knowledge of the forest to neutralize American advantages. They adapted their defensive positions as American tactics evolved. They maintained discipline and fighting spirit even when outnumbered and outgunned. The American commanders who ordered frontal assaults into the forest did not understand this. They believed that overwhelming force would compensate for tactical disadvantages. They believed that doctrine developed for one type of terrain would work in another. They believed that the German soldier was too beaten to resist effectively. Eddie Brennan, lying in the frozen mud with leaves covering his body, understood what his generals did not. The forest was neutral. It favored whoever learned to use it. And in the Hürtgen, learning to use the forest meant abandoning assumptions and embracing discomfort. If you have stayed with us this far into the story, now would be a good time to hit the like button and subscribe if you have not already. This channel depends on your support to continue producing these in-depth explorations of military history. The technique Eddie developed has echoes in conflicts that came afterward. In Vietnam, American snipers operating in jungle terrain faced similar challenges. Elevated positions that worked in open country became death traps in dense vegetation. The soldiers who survived learned, as Eddie had learned, that the ground itself could provide concealment that no amount of camouflage netting could match. In modern asymmetric warfare, where sophisticated surveillance technology can detect movement and heat signatures from great distances. The principle of becoming part of the terrain remains relevant. Special operations snipers today spend hours constructing hides that incorporate natural materials that match the temperature and texture of the surrounding ground, that present no recognizable human shape to searching sensors. Eddie Brennan did not invent these concepts. Snipers throughout history have used ground-level concealment when circumstances demanded it. But in the specific hell of the Hürtgen Forest, he demonstrated their effectiveness under conditions so extreme that conventional doctrine had completely failed. The Hürtgen itself has changed since 1944. The forests have regrown. The shell craters have filled with decades of fallen needles. The bunkers have crumbled into moss-covered ruins. But traces of the battle remain. Farmers still occasionally uncover unexploded ordnance when plowing their fields. Hikers come across rusted equipment and scattered bones in the deeper woods. In Kleinhau, a small museum commemorates the battle. In Wassenack, a memorial stands in the village square. At the Kahl Bridge, where so many Americans died trying to supply troops trapped across the ravine, a sculpture recalls the brief ceasefire that allowed German and American medics to treat the wounded of both sides. There is also a unique memorial in the Hürtgen Military Cemetery. A stone monument with a bronze plaque was placed by veterans of the American 4th Infantry Division to honor a German lieutenant named Friedrich Lengfeld. On November 12, 1944, Lengfeld was mortally wounded while trying to help a wounded American soldier out of a minefield known as the Wild Sow. It is the only memorial for a German soldier placed by his former enemies in a German military cemetery. That story of an enemy officer dying while trying to save an American life captures something important about the Hürtgen. The battle was brutal beyond description. Men on both sides suffered and died in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. But even in that darkness, individual acts of humanity occurred, moments when soldiers recognized the common suffering of all men in combat. Eddie Brennan never spoke publicly about his experiences in the Hürtgen. After the war, he returned to Philadelphia and resumed work on the docks. He married, raised children, and lived quietly until his passing in 1987. His military records note the court-martial, the reduction in rank, the subsequent restoration of rank after continued effective service. They do not capture what he felt lying in that frozen mud, watching German soldiers walk past without knowing death was inches beneath their feet. The Hürtgen Forest was a place where the normal rules of warfare broke down. American technological superiority meant nothing when armor could not navigate the terrain and aircraft could not see through the canopy. German defensive preparations meant nothing when American artillery could detonate shells in the tree branches and turn the forest itself into a weapon. Victory in that environment went not to the side with more resources, but to the individuals who could adapt, who could think beyond their training, who could survive. Eddie Brennan adapted. He thought beyond his training. He survived. And in doing so, he demonstrated a truth that military institutions sometimes struggle to accept. The soldier on the ground often understands the battlefield better than the general in the headquarters. The forest floor technique that nearly ended his career is now studied in military academies around the world, not because it was revolutionary, but because it illustrates the gap that can exist between doctrine and reality. Every student officer who reads about the Hürtgen learns that terrain dictates tactics. Eddie Brennan proved that lesson in the most direct way possible. 18 German soldiers eliminated in a single morning, from a position so low that the enemy could not conceive of its existence. That was the legacy of a Philadelphia dock worker who remembered how deer survived in the Pennsylvania woods. The Hürtgen claimed many lives. It broke units and commanders. It exposed failures of planning and imagination at the highest levels of the American Army. But it also revealed what individual soldiers could accomplish when they trusted their instincts and adapted to their environment. Eddie Brennan was one of those soldiers. His story is not found in the official histories of the campaign. His name does not appear on the memorials at Vosnack or Kleinhau. But in the frozen ground of that shattered forest, he found a way to fight that the Germans never expected. They banned his forest floor sniper hide, until it took down 18 Germans in a single day, and then, grudgingly, they let him continue. Some lessons can only be learned in blood. Some truths can only be discovered by those willing to crawl through the mud. Eddie Brennan crawled through the mud of the Hürtgen Forest, and what he discovered there saved lives, changed tactics, and left a legacy that endures to this day. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most grueling and forgotten battles. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing it with others who appreciate the real stories behind military history. Every subscription helps this channel continue bringing these accounts to light. Until next time, remember the men who fought in places like the Hürtgen. Remember what they endured. And remember that sometimes the greatest victories come from those who had the courage to question the rules.